Welcome back, everyone. This is probably going to be one of my most important videos that I will ever make. And the sad thing is, I have a very low subscriber count and very low view counts for these videos right now, although this is going to be immensely important, what we're about to talk about. I'm going to start by setting the context here. So the context is something called Project Eldest Son. Let's go ahead. You can look at the Wikipedia, but I want to go ahead and read through this piece on the history of Mac v. SOG. During the Vietnam War, the Studies and Observation Group, SOG, created an ingenious top-secret program called Project Eldest Son to wreak general mayhem and cause the Viet Cong and NVA to doubt the safety of their guns and ammunition. Amid a firefight near the Cambodian border on June 6, 1968, a North Vietnamese army soldier spotted an American GI raising his rifle, and the NVA infantryman pulled his trigger, anticipating a muzzle blast, but got a blast all right, but not quite what he expected. United States 1st Infantry Division troops later found the enemy soldier sprawled beside his Chinese Type 56 AK, quite dead, but not from small arms fire. Peculiarly, they could see his rifle had exploded, its shattered receiver deleting him instantly. It seemed a great mystery that his AK had blown up since nothing was blocking the bore. Bad metallurgy, the GIs concluded, or possibly defective ammo. It was neither. In reality, this actual incident was the calculated handiwork of one of Vietnam War's most secret and least understood covert operations, Project Eldest Son. So secret was this sabotage effort that few GIs in Southeast Asia ever heard of it or the organization behind it. The innocuously named Studies and Observation Group, as the Vietnam War's top secret Special Ops Task Force, SOG operators, Army Special Forces, Air Force Air Commandos, and Navy SEALs worked directly for the Joint Chiefs, executing highly classified, deniable missions in the enemy's backyard of Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Oh, it says Cambodia and North Vietnam. There's a typo there. This happens when you read from a script. The genesis of Eldest Son was the fertile mind of SOG's commander. From 1966 to 1968, that is Colonel John K. Singlaub, a World War II veteran of covert actions with the Office of Strategic Services. I was frustrated by the fact that I couldn't airlift the ammunition we were discovering on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, Singlaub explained. It was not unusual for SOG's small recon teams, composed of 2 or 3 American Green Berets and 4 to 6 native soldiers, to find tons of ammunition in enemy base camps and caches along the Laotian highway system. But SOG teams lacked the manpower to secure the sites or carry the ordnance away. Further, it could not be burned up, and demolition would only scatter small arm ammunition, not destroy it. Initially, I thought of just booby-trapping it so that they'd pick up a case and it would blow up, Singlaub recalled. Then it hit him. Booby-trap the ammunition itself. Though obscure, this trick was not new. In the 1930s, to combat rebellious tribesmen in northwestern India's Waziristan, the same lawless region where Taliban and Al-Qaeda terrorists hide today, the British Army planted sabotaged .303 rifle ammunition. Even before that, during the Second Medabelle War, 1896 to 1897, in today's Zimbabwe, British scouts, led by the American adventurer Frederick Russell Burnham, had slipped explosive packed rifle cartridges into hostile stockpiles to deadly effect. SOG would do likewise. The Joint Chiefs decided on August 30th, 1967, but first, Colonel Singlaub arranged for CIA ordnance experts to conduct a quick feasibility study. A few weeks later, at Camp Chinen, Okinawa, Singlaub watched a CIA technician load a sabotaged 7.62 by 39mm cartridge into a bench-mounted AK rifle. It completely blew up the receiver, and the bolt was projected backwards, Singlaub observed. I would imagine into the head of the firer. After that success began a month of tedious bullet pulling and to manually disassemble thousands of 7.62 millimeter cartridges, made more difficult because Chinese ammo had a tough lacquer seal where the bullet seated into the case. In this process, some bullets suffered tiny scrapes, but when reloaded, these marks seeded out of the sight below the case mouth. Rounds were inspected to ensure they showed no signs of tampering. When the job was done, 11,565 AK rounds had been sabotaged, along with 556 rounds for the Communist bloc's heavy 12.7mm machine gun, a major anti-helicopter weapon. Eldest Son cartridges originally were reloaded with a powder similar to PETN, high explosive, but sufficiently shock sensitive that an ordinary rifle primer would detonate it. The white powder, however, did not even faintly resemble gunpowder. SOG's technical wizard, Ben Baker, our answer to James Bond's quote-unquote Q, decided this powder might compromise the program if ever an enemy soldier pulled apart an Eldest Son round. He obtained a substitute explosive so closely resembled gunpowder that it would pass inspection by anyone but an ordnance expert. While the AKM and Type 56 AKs and the RPD light machine gun could accommodate a chamber pressure of 45,000 psi, Baker's deadly powder generated a whopping 250,000 psi. So approximately 5 times stronger. Sabotaging the ammunition proved the easiest challenge. The CIA's Okinawa lab also did a very professional job of prying open ammo crates, unsealing interior metal cans, and then repacking them so there was no sign of tampering. In addition to SOG sabotaging 7.62mm and 12.7mm rounds, these CIA ordnance experts perfected a special fuse for the communist 82mm mortar round that would detonate the hand-dropped projectile while inside the mortar tube for especially devastating effects. Exactly 1,968 of these mortar rounds were sabotaged too. Project Eldest Son's greatest challenge was placement. Getting the infernal devices into the enemy logistics system without detection. That's where SOG's Green Beret-led recon teams came in. Since the fall of 1965, our small teams had been running deniable missions into Laos to gather intelligence, wiretap enemy communications, kidnap key enemy personnel, ambush convoys, raid supply dumps, plant mines, and generally make life as difficult as possible in enemy rear areas. As an additional mission, each team carried along a few Eldest Son rounds, usually as a single round in an otherwise full AK magazine, or one round in an RPD machine gun belt, or a sealed ammo can, to plant whenever an opportunity arose. When an SOG team discovered an ammo dump, they planted Eldest Son. When an SOG team ambushed an enemy patrol, they switched magazines in a dead soldier's AK. It was critically important never to plant more than one round per magazine, belt, or ammo can, so no amount of searching after a gun exploded would uncover a second round, to preclude the enemy from determining this was sabotage. Planting sabotage 82mm round mortar ammo proved more cumbersome because these were not transported as loose rounds, but in 3-round wooden cases. Thus, you had to tote a whole case, which must have weighed more than 25 pounds. Twice I recall carrying such crates for insertion in enemy areas, and to our surprise, my team once witnessed a platoon of NBA soldiers carry one away. SOG's most clever insertion was accomplished by SOG SEALs, operating in the Mekong Delta, where they filled a captured sampan with tainted cases of ammunition, shot it tastefully full of bullet holes, and then spilled chicken blood over it and set it adrift upstream from a known Viet Cong village. Of course, the VC assumed the boat's communist crew had fallen overboard during the ambush. The Viet Cong took the ammunition hook, line, and sinker. In Laos, American B-52s constantly targeted enemy logistical areas, which churned up sizable pieces of terrain. SOG exploited this opportunity by organizing a special team that landed just after B-52 strikes to construct false bunkers in such devastated tracks, then quote-unquote salt these stockpiles with eldest son ammunition. However, on November 30th, 1968, the helicopter carrying SOG's secret eldest son team flying some 20 miles west of the Khe Sanh Marine Base was hit by an enemy 37mm anti-aircraft round, setting off a tremendous mid-air explosion, which, I have to point out, that's very ironic, because they were targeting these systems in order to make them explode when using their ammunitions, and they were struck down by one while carrying that ammunition. Just the irony can't get lost here. Back to the piece. 7 cases of tainted 82mm round ammunition detonated, killing everyone on board, including Major Samuel Toomey and 7 U.S. Army Green Berets. Their remains were not recovered for 20 years. But as a result of the cross-border efforts, eldest son rounds began to turn up inside South Vietnam. In a northern province, 101st Airborne paratroopers found a dead communist soldier grasping his exploded rifle, while an officer at SOG's Saigon headquarters, Captain Ed Lesensny, received the photo of a dead enemy soldier with his bolt blown out the back of his AK. It had gone right through his eye socket, he reported. Chad Spar, an intelligence specialist with the 1st Infantry Division, heard of such a case, but didn't believe it until he walked me over and opened up the body bag, and there he was, with the weapon in the bag. Unaware of SOG's covert program, Spar attributed the incident to inferior weapons and ammo. You see, inside our own military, the awareness was so tightly kept that even our own personnel didn't realize. 1 second here while I get a drink of water. Booby-trapped mortar rounds took their toll too. 25th Infantry Division soldiers came upon an entire enemy mortar battery destroyed. 4 peeled-back tubes with dead gunners. In another incident, a 101st Airborne fire base was taking mortar fire when they heard an odd boom, poof. A patrol leader later found 2 enemy bodies beside a split mortar tube and blood trails going off into the jungle. On July 3rd, 1968, after an enemy mortar attack on the Banh Mi Tut airstrip, 9 communist soldiers were found dead in one firing position, their tube so badly shattered that it vanished, but for 2 small fragments. Booby-trapped ammunition clearly was getting into enemy hands, so it was time to initiate SOG's insidious black PSYOP exploitation. And this is a PSYOP, psychological warfare. Our interest was not in killing the soldier that was using the weapon, and here's the key, explained Colonel Steve Kavanaugh, who replaced Singlaub in 1968. We were trying to leave in the minds of the North Vietnamese, and insert here Hezbollah, insert here people seeking to use communications. Then you don't want them to use communications, you want them to be scared to use those. You want them to be scared to use their vehicles. All right. That the ammunition that they were getting from China was bad ammunition. Hopefully, this would aggravate Hanoi's leadership, which traditionally distrusted the Chinese, and cause individual soldiers to question the reliability and safety of their Chinese-supplied arms and ordnance. One Viet Cong document forged by SOG and insinuated into enemy channels through a double agent made light of exploding weapons, claiming, "We know that it is rumored some of the ammunition has exploded in the AK-47. This report is greatly exaggerated. It is a very, very small percentage of the ammunition that has exploded." Another forged document announced only a few thousand such cases have been found thus far, and concluded the People's Republic of China may have been having some quality control problems, but these are being worked out, and we think that in the future there will be very little chance of this happening. That, in the near future hook, was especially devious because an enemy soldier looking at lot numbers could see that virtually all his ammo had been loaded years ago. See how devious this is. No fresh ammo could possibly reach soldiers fighting in the South for many years. What would this do to your psychology if you're admitting to there had been some quality control issues in the past, perhaps, but they're fixing it now, and you know you're not getting any of that new ammo? you're getting the potentially tainted stuff, potentially the ones that are exploding. Next came Overt Safety Campaign with Military Assistance Command Vietnam, also known as MACV, publishing Technical Intelligence Brief number 2-68, Analysis of Damaged Weapons. Openly circulated to U.S. and South Vietnamese units, this SOG-inspired study examined several exploded AKs, concluding that they were destroyed by defective metallurgy resulting in fatigue cracks or faulty ammunition, which produced excessive chamber pressure. An SOG operative left a copy at a Saigon bar whose owners were suspected enemy agents. You see, planting the psychological warfare that you want intentionally, but making it look like an accident. Under the guise of cautioning GIs against using enemy weapons, warnings were sent to Armed Forces Radio and the TV. The civilian stateside tabloid Army Times warned, numerous incidents have caused injury and sometimes death to the operators of enemy weapons, the cause of which was defective metallurgy or faulty ammo. The 25th Infantry Division newspaper similarly warned soldiers on July 14, 1969, that because of poor quality control procedures in communist bloc factories, many AKs with even a slight malfunction will blow up when fired. Despite such warnings, some GIs fired captured arms, and inevitably, one American's souvenir AK exploded, inflicting serious but not fatal injuries. That incident spurred SOG itself to stop using captured ammunition in our own AKs and RPD machine guns. SOG purchased commercial 7.62 ammunition through a Finnish middleman, and ironically, this ammo, which SOG's covert operators fired at the communist foes, had been manufactured in a Soviet arsenal in Petrograd. By mid-1969, word about eldest son began leaking out, and the articles in the New York Times and Time compelling SOG to change the codename to Italian Green, or later to Pole Bean. As of July 1st, 1969, a declassified report shows SOG operatives had inserted 3,638 rounds of sabotage 7.62 mm plus 167 rounds of 12.7 mm and 821 rounds of 82 mm mortar ammunition. That fall, the Joint Chiefs directed SOG to dispose of its remaining stockpile and end the program. In November, my team was specially tasked to insert as much eldest son as possible, making multiple landings on the Laotian border to get rid of the stuff before authority expired. Lacking the earlier finesse, such insertions had to have confirmed to the enemy that they were sabotaging his ammunition, but even this, as SOG believed, was psychologically useful, creating a big shell game in which the enemy had to question endlessly which ammunition was polluted and which was not. The enemy came to fear any cache where there was evidence that SOG recon teams had got near it, and thanks to radio intercepts, SOG headquarters learned that the enemy's highest level of command had expressed concerns about exploding arms, Chinese quality control, and sabotage. In that sense, Project Eldest Son was a total success. But, as with any such covert deception program, you can never quite be sure. So a bit of a long read there, but I think it's important in setting the context here. And there was even a piece that causes me to think of something else. So we had a mention here of, maybe it was USSR. So we see here, this paragraph, that incident spurred SOG itself to stop using captured ammunition in our own AKs and RPD machine guns. SOG purchased commercial 7.62 mm ammunition through a Finnish middleman. Notice that's important, the middleman. And ironically, this ammo, which SOG's covert operators fired at their communist foes, had been manufactured in a Soviet arsenal in Petrograd. So we see a Soviet communist manufacturer producing ammo, going through a middleman, and going on to the Soviets' enemy, the US. Very ironic. Now, this is interesting as well. Could the Soviets, knowing this ammo was going to the US, have done the same thing because this ammo was used for actually firing at the Viet Cong? And therein lies the context, part of the context of what we're going to go over today. So here, I have my outline for this discussion. Let me go ahead and fix this on the screen. All right. See the initial context there. We just went through Project Eldest Son first. And so Project Eldest Son is labeled as a great success overall. The question is, why did the US lose in Vietnam, although it won far more battles, had far less casualties, and executed many successful programs, such as Project Eldest Son? And here is the overarching theme: the finite goal versus the infinite goal. The Viet Cong, even though these things were going on and they were concerned about the safety of firing their weapons, nonetheless would fire their weapons down to the last person if required. The US, on the other hand, was playing to win the game. The North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, were fighting to continue to exist, an existential fight. The US was fighting to win the game. Why did the US lose in Afghanistan? The US was fighting to win the game. The Taliban were fighting to continue to exist. Why did the US lose in Iraq? The US was fighting to win the game, and all of the organizations the US was fighting against was fighting to continue to exist. Why did Russia lose in Afghanistan? The same story. Why are NATO countries pulling out of Africa and essentially losing in their efforts in those areas? And losing in your efforts is failure. It is not success. It's the opposite. It is failure. You set out on a goal, on a mission, and you have failed that which you were trying to do. Okay, so this poses the next question. Why did Japan finally surrender in World War II? You see, they expanded across the Pacific, and they were pushed back in the island hopping campaign all the way back to their main island. Why did Japan finally surrender after the second nuke went off, and eyeing the Russians and thinking that a Soviet invasion was also potentially possible? Well, in that situation, yes, the US was still fighting to win the game. The Japanese had an infinite goal. They were fighting to continue to exist, and they thought they had to expand in order to continue to exist because they had sanctions put against them as far as metal and petroleum, neither of which Japan is able to produce at the scale that it needs to be a world power to continue to exist in the modern game. It wasn't until they could envision the entire annihilation of Japan's existence that they surrendered. The first nuclear weapon wasn't enough. It was after the second nuclear explosion on Japan and looking at a potential Russian invasion that they said, we will be annihilated as the Japanese people if we do not surrender. So in that context, they were still fighting the infinite game. If the game is to continue to exist, and there's a serious chance of your entire annihilation of your people, then the only option is to surrender and to continue to stay in the game at all. Why do some companies succeed for several decades while others fail and go out of business quickly? The same context, why do some businesses that had been immensely successful suddenly and rapidly go out of business? They pivot from having an infinite goal of staying in the game, and they pivot towards trying to win the game. They don't have the flexibility to adapt to changing situations. They focus on finite goals, perhaps profit earnings for the quarter, for the month, your stock price, paying out CEOs large sums of money. And those large sums of money are tied to hitting very finite goals instead of infinite goals. It's the same thing over and over again. And most countries, organizations, and companies have no idea of this context. Once you do, everything snaps into alignment and the paradigm makes sense. So with that context, Project Eldest Son, the finite game versus the infinite game, let's look at Israel and the explosions happening there. And Lebanon, I should say. So let's look internally first. The Middle East and the areas that have high kinetic probability. So that would be all the regions of the Middle East, North Africa, right? And the various factions there. So on one side, you could say you have Israel and Islamists. And in the Islamists, you have Sunni and Shia. You also have the Kurds. You have various factions that also are warring against each other. However, they all seem to have one common enemy. And that common enemy just changed the era of warfare as we know it. It is large-scale, rapid Project Eldest Son, in which they have already infected the logistics and supply stream for these various entities. And not only combatants, but also targeting non-combatants, your civilian population. So you have to ask, what does that do to the psychological state of all these various factions? One faction completely aligned, or I should say all aligned against Israel, but also warring against each other. And then Israel against all of them. You could say in many regards that pulls the US and some UN and NATO entities into it as well. And there's more on that in a bit. So psychological, it creates a truly bona fide existential conflict now. The key to this is putting yourself in the shoes of the people carrying these pagers, these cell phones around, riding these scooter bikes, driving these cars that are exploding. And you have to put yourself in the shoes of their ideology. They don't know when Israel could detonate this stuff, and they don't know the scope in which these things have been infected with or tampered with. So you're now going from a long-term existential conflict, and you're pulling that into a very near-term scope. And that's key, because that's when you see things escalate exponentially, right? So people can often imagine a linear escalation. Okay, well, there's going to be this linear progression of conflict, and eventually we're going to have this war that happens, and then things will go exponential. However, that just got pulled forward with those actions. So here's the thought. If they're going to destroy forces and civilians slowly, and at will, and uncontested, then why not escalate now if you're the Islamists? If you're going to be drained of your sources and of your resources by being targeted kinetically, and and it doesn't give you the ability to fight back. You have no ability to fight back against this unless you do a check of all of your stuff. And we're seeing radios exploding. We're seeing pagers exploding. We're seeing cars, moped, logistics exploding. The scope of this is potentially a lot broader. And Israel came out today saying they have a lot more up their sleeve than just this that they haven't revealed. What could be the unintended consequences of creating additional fighters that are seeking revenge? So let's say we have reports of non-combatant personnel being targeted with this stuff. Likely unintentionally, but nonetheless still targeted. What does that do to those people that have brothers, cousins, husbands, fathers? Escalation exponentially. You've targeted one person and created perhaps 2, 3, 4, 10 more people from that one person you targeted. And we see that in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. that same principle playing out, right? You blow up 4 Taliban and you created 10 more. You blow up those 10 and you've created 40 more. You blow up those 40 and you've created 150 more. It's exponential, compounding. At the same time, we see Israel admitting to this as if it's a flex. Now, overconfidence, whether you're talking about the stock market, whether you're talking about job opportunities, whether you're talking about your position at work, whether you're talking about politicians, whether you're talking about warfare, overconfidence and underestimating your opponents often leads to cataclysmic events for that overconfident entity. An additional unintended consequence is potential impact on Western countries who provide support to Israel. And we know that the Western borders, for the most part, are wide open to everyone. Another point to the psychological aspect here is it wasn't a single event. There was a single event that happened yesterday. And so there was the initial event. Then there was the reaction to that event. People had burials or wakes or whatever they call them. Then there was a secondary event during those reactions. So now you're taking away the enemy's ability to even bury their people and hold remembrance events. That will, when you disturb the grieving process, that's when you create radical behavior. One of the ways you create radical behavior. So this presents a new era of warfare. Historically, the groups that were primary targets of these attacks, often referred to as terrorist groups, had been engaging in this style of warfare. Now, they're being targeted using some of their methods. However, here in the West, countries subscribe to processes and protocols and procedures of what we deem allowable in warfare. And if you look at Chapter 26, Section 2B, Volume 2, Subchapter 29, labeled Disarmament, this section has the introductory paragraph stating protocol on prohibitions or restrictions on the use of mines, booby traps, and other devices as amended on 3rd of May, 1996, Protocol 2, as amended on 3rd May, 1996, annexed to the Convention on Prohibitions and Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects. Indiscriminate effects, meaning it could end up targeting civilians, non-combatants, indiscriminately. This was signed by Israel on October 30th, 2000. And I'll share the link in this video. But let's go ahead and take a look at that. So scroll down. I believe it's on page 29 here. No, it's on between page 29 and 30. Paragraph 4. Booby trap means any device or material which is designed, constructed, or adapted to kill or injure and which functions unexpectedly when a person disturbs or approaches an apparently harmless object or performs an apparently safe act. That is a very key definition here. It is prohibited to use mines, booby traps, or other devices which may employ a mechanism or device specifically designed to detonate the munition by the presence of a commonly available mine detectors as a result. Oh, okay, sorry. I thought there was another section here. Anyways, that previous section specifically defines what a booby trap is. When this person thinks they are about to perform an apparently safe act, using a pager, using a phone, riding a scooter, driving a car, walking into a communications cell phone shop, right? You think you're performing an apparently safe act, and the object that you're approaching or using is in fact booby-trapped, and it targets you as this begins indiscriminately. So we've gone over these items. Let's go back here. And let us stretch this back out. So again, it's no longer a single event. It's a single event that causes a reaction, then you also target that event. We saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan. IEDs would maybe detonate on the first vehicle, and initially, before lessons learned, those vehicles might stop, or you might have a dismount, or a number of other procedures in which secondary devices would then be detonated based on those reactions. And now, we're seeing that happen, but as someone who signed a UN document saying they will not do that. Okay, so that's internal, Middle East, high kinetic probability. What does this do in that area? And there's probably a lot more stuff I'm not even covering here, but just to create a context and a framework of why this event actually means more than what most people are attributing time and effort towards understanding. How about external? These are people that are observers of these events, low kinetic probability repercussions from these events or reaction to these events. So the US, NATO, the West, Africa, South America, Australia, parts of Europe, right? Now I say low kinetic probability initially, right? Meaning these people aren't going to suddenly react and go to Israel and attack, and they're not likely to be attacked by Israel in those locations. However, there could be second, third, fourth order of magnitude effects, and that's what we're about to get into. So let's start with trust of Israelis. And I pose this question: is there already a broad developing thought about Israelis and Jewish people over the past few years? And unequivocally, you would have to say yes, because there has been an anti-Semitism narrative being built over the past year. And you can see this in comment sections on media. You can see this on social media posts and comments. You can see that. And you can see the anti-Semitism narrative being built over the past year. And so within this category, you have individuals, you have businesses, you have governments. And I pose the question, are these entities capable of effectively speaking out about their concerns of their employees and personnel? And why would that be important? Well, in order to tamper with these devices at their manufacturing or production facilities, you would have had to have planted people somewhere inside the logistics channel before these devices arrived at their end user. Meaning somewhere along that route, in some company's hands, there was an operative that engaged with these devices. And if there is an anti-Semitism narrative being built, do you feel like you can effectively speak out about concerns when perhaps you see someone with a Jewish last name? You see the narrative led the action that's coming. And that's why it's important to pay attention to these narratives as they're being built, because it means some sort of event is coming. They don't build these narratives for no reason. This is a cover psychological operation to prevent people from being able to speak out and address their concerns within their organizations, because doing so will label you as an anti-Semite because you're speaking out against the Jewish people and Israelis. You see how this works. You're stuck in a loop where you can't address the issue that is happening. How about the notion of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about IoT devices? And that's Internet of Things, right? So your phone, back in the day, had iPods. You have pagers. You have walkie-talkies, radios, right? All these devices that have batteries in them and have the capability for small explosives to be planted in them. What has it done to your use of your device? For a moment there, as I posed in my video yesterday, did you like, oh crap, I never thought about that? Does this feed into the developing thoughts towards Israel and Jewish people, or does this counter that position? Obviously, it feeds into those developing thoughts of mistrusting those people. we see that there's broad, random, indiscriminate civilian casualties occurring alongside this. And so, for people in the West seeing this, do you think that generates more support for the Israelis? Quite the contrary. I mean, Western beliefs supposedly are that we don't target civilians, that we don't have indiscriminate activities happening. Even if you look at Project Eldest Son, it was only people who would have been firing munitions against U.S. forces that would have been attacked. It met the UN Protocol 2. We even formed the Geneva Conventions, establishing what war crimes are, establishing what's allowable and not allowable in warfare, saying we will hold to these truths, these morals, these ethics, even though our enemies may not. And supposedly, as of October 30, 2000, Israel said it believes in those same things, but alas, actions speak louder than words. And I go on to say the West has fought several conflicts and blah, blah, blah. However, it has also participated in unintentional or perhaps uncalculated civilian casualties via drone strikes from the era of about 2008 to 2020. Externally, supply chain weaknesses, right? Businesses, governments, individuals. The NATO in the West will now be forced to examine their products that could be susceptible to these intrusions. But you won't be able to necessarily do a root cause corrective action and removing the people from the organizations who have infiltrated it, if they're still there. How about for Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and what is becoming an Eastern alliance against NATO in the West? Could they be susceptible to that? You've seen Putin going around making new partnerships with a lot of these countries. Is there potential corruption in these countries? Do we see evidence of that? Could money motivate people to allow certain things to happen as long as they get paid and they get a chance to buy a 130-foot yacht and live in the Mediterranean Sea? Perhaps. Businesses will have to conduct internal reviews of their processes and procedures, especially ones involved in these industries where we see these explosions happening. And that goes back to the anti-Semitism narrative. What can you really do in the face of this narrative? And will this ultimately be an event that destroys anti-Semitism? Because you see, this stuff had to have some cause, some internal effect, some person infiltrating this stuff in order to have this effect later on to the end user. It will be undeniable. So Russia, Ukraine, NATO. Let's go over here. So we had a massive explosion that happened. We'll go ahead and watch some of these videos.
О, смотри, 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 идет сюда. Офигеть, сейчас.
Sorry, I just realized my microphone was detonated or was muted. So when I first saw this, initially I thought this was a nuclear detonation, even though I had seen reports of this happening and saying it was an ammunition dump, and potentially yes, potentially no. We'll have to wait for more evidence to come out. Initially, first thought looking at this was that seems an awfully lot like a nuclear device. And then you see the size of the detonation in the background, and looking at potential distance here, that looks like several kilometers away from this location. You look at the size, do some triangulation. It looks like a pretty similar sized explosion.
Вот, видели эту волну? Просто жесть. А как светло было, вообще капец.
And again, secondary explosions going off all around. Massive, massive implications from this strike.
Так, ну я думаю, что пора, парни, блядь.
Here's some more videos.
Пердыши уже горят. Ну, сама видишь, да, разницу? Сейчас вот дойдем. О! Пизда мне. Оглохну опять нахуй. Два!
Unfortunately, it looks like this person maybe doesn't know how to
Пойду переодеваться, потому что сегодня у многих калитка отваливается.
About as good as my mic muting and unmuting. Right, so just absolutely massive explosions. But what does this mean? Well, let's take a look. So Russia/Ukraine plus NATO. It was an explosion. It's being reported that it's an explosion on the magnitude of a small yield nuclear device. Although the device used to strike might not have been a nuclear device, the result is being suggested to be similar to that of strikes on Japan in World War II, but of course without the nuclear fallout factor. And that factor might be the only thing that prevents an escalation by Russia into using similar sized devices, but of the nuclear sort. That's my next question. Does this open the door for small yield nuclear devices to now be used? The question is, would Russia use them? And I think yes, under the right circumstances they would. And in what other circumstances or in what scenario would Russia use them? So let's say you're Russia and you just went around forging new partnerships for ammunition for a long war, potentially a prolonged war. And that infers a few things. You need to increase your productions to meet consumption rates. Otherwise, you wouldn't go and form those partnerships. And now, massive amount of your stockpile and your capability to wage war has just been struck. Does this then, as you, Russia, back you further and further into a corner to where you might have to use nuclear weapons, or becomes a more viable option in order to, and this is key, continue to exist? I think Russia sees this war as an existential fight against the West, meaning its ability to continue to exist with its values is at stake. I believe Ukraine thinks the same, and I believe the West is fighting to win the game. And we see how most of the time that doesn't lead to victory. Only when your opponent can envision the entire annihilation of its people, only then will the infinite player drop out. The only way to drop out of the infinite game is you either lose the will or the resources to continue to fight the game. Japan had lost the resources, and it had lost the will because it could no longer envision continuing to exist. It envisioned complete annihilation of its people. That is the only way to make the infinite player drop out of the game. So, if you don't have the will to stay in the fight necessarily, your people, your population, if you have the resources to make the other player drop out, then you're in the game and you can win it. Because it leaves you the ability to define what the game is, the world order of things. This was also a large attack inside of Russia / on Russian territory. What is going to be the reaction of the population to this information? Well, in fact, we see this information actually seems to be getting suppressed in Russia. Although I'm sure people will eventually get their information because Telegram's still allowed, and we know Telegram is obviously a source of information that you won't find in the mainstream outlets. But there's really only two reactions from the population. Some might call to end the war through diplomatic means. Let's reach a peace agreement. Let's stop this. It's escalating significantly. And there could be those saying, let's escalate the war to end it through kinetic means. Those are really only the two options. End through diplomacy or escalate to quote unquote win. And doing so, escalating means larger proportions of kinetic output. What will this do to the population's psychology? I mean, certainly there had to be civilians in that area. Certainly there has to be people that are going to be casualties of explosions of that magnitude. Now, the number of people impacted, probably fairly small. The number of indirect people impacted, meaning they had a family member or a friend, probably relatively small on the scale of the total population of Russia. However, the more these events occur, the more you will hear outcries from people, from the population, to end the war. So a strike on Russian territory, especially this magnitude, with the other strikes that have happened on Russian territory over the past few weeks, is putting a lot of pressure on Russia to either end the war through diplomatic means or to escalate it and call Ukraine and the West's bluff. That's all I have for this episode. Again, I think this is going to be some of the most important information I will cover until that day when we do see things escalate into the use of outright nuclear weapons, and we see things like what Israel's doing being done on large scales and their large scale response to that, and tell those people, those Islamist countries who are looking at this and saying they can basically just pick us off randomly as militants, but also our civilian population. The longer we wait, the longer we give them the opportunity to continue to do this stuff and bleed us dry. Death by 1,000 cuts. Until next time, stay exponentially aware.